And I'm wondering if we can start by just giving us sort of a sense of how this is playing all of a sudden in a campaign that had been almost entirely devoid of foreign policy discussion prior to the events in Libya.
Yeah, sure. Well, the embassy protests in Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia as well, have obviously put it on the top of the U.S. agenda, at least for a couple days. And you saw a lot of attacks back and forth between the Romney campaign and Obama. Romney attacking Obama for being soft and for not taking a strong stand and so on. But I'm not sure that the embassy protests and the killing of Ambassador Stevens have really gotten us to a real substantive debate about U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East, about reassessing foreign policy. So even White House spokesman Jay Carney kept on saying, this is about a film, this is not about the administration, this is not about U.S. policy. So they were resisting getting into a broader discussion of what this means for the Obama administration's strategy in the region. So I'm not sure that we've had the most illuminating public debate. There's a lot of attacks and a lot of hyperbole on the Islamist threat without really understanding who the Islamists are, distinguishing between different groups. I don't think a lot of that nuance has come through in the public debate.
So let's tack back and talk about the actual record of the administration in this area. You say reassessing the Obama administration strategy and sort of the question of grand strategy in the Middle East. What has been their grand strategy that you would want to see reassessed?
Yeah, well, I hate to kind of buy into easy cliches, but I do think that leading from behind is a somewhat appropriate way of describing the Obama administration's policy. Which includes a kind of principled non-interventionism, the idea that these are protests and movements that are fundamentally indigenous. They're not about the U.S., they're about Arabs, and we should kind of step back and take something of a hands-off approach. Of course, a totally hands-off approach is impossible considering American interests in the region, but I do think the Obama administration has really tried to reduce its footprint in responding to the Arab Spring.
You sound skeptical of that. I mean, is that a fundamentally wrong judgment on the administration's part?
Well, I do think that the instinct is admirable, especially after the Bush administration's very heavy footprint. But I do think that if we understand the Arab Spring as something on the level of 1989 or post-World War II, then that changes the way we approach it. And if you look at the aid that the new aid that the Obama administration has committed to the Arab awakenings writ large, we're not talking about a lot of new assistance. So if you compare the tens of billions that went to the Marshall Plan and the very small amount that has been committed to the Arab Spring, you see there's a lack of prioritization. It hasn't been at the top of the agenda the way that I think it should, considering what's at stake for U.S. interests. And I think it's instructive. People say, well, Arabs don't want us to be involved. And yes, there is a lot of anger towards the U.S. role in the region. But if you look at some of these, protests and revolutionary movements and rebel movements in Libya and Syria, or even Bahrain to some extent, protesters in their time of need, they don't look east, they don't look to Russia and China. They still say, we want the U.S. to support our struggle, to the extent where Libyan rebels, if you recall, were literally pleading for U.S. intervention, saying, where is the U.S.? And ultimately they were right. Without the U.S. decision to support the NATO operation in Libya, it would have never happened. So in some sense, the Arab Spring, yes, is fundamentally about Arabs and their own movements, but at the same time, international factors, in my view, are still decisive. They were decisive in Libya. They're proving to be, or will prove to be, decisive in Syria. You could even argue that in Egypt, U.S. pressure was critical to helping ease Mubarak out of office. So the list goes on, and I do think, and Yemen certainly, where Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, and also the U.S. played an important mediating role. So what I take from this is that there is still a very important role for the U.S. and its allies to play in supporting these movements.
And one, in your judgment, that the Obama administration has not quite faced. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the response has been tepid in many respects. And the question that I get from a lot of Arab colleagues in the region when I'm traveling is, what does the U.S. really want? Where does the U.S. really stand? Are they really supporting these pro-democracy movements, or are they doing business as usual? And if you look at all the different cases, it's very inconsistent and very incoherent. So yes, on Egypt and Tunisia and their transitions now, the U.S. is supporting those transitions. I don't think as much as it should, but still, it's a positive stance. Now, if you look at the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, for example, or the monarchies of Morocco and Jordan, there has been very little change in U.S. policy. If you compare the current policy to what was there in 2009, almost no difference whatsoever. So I think the argument that the Obama administration hasn't really learned from the Arab Spring is maybe not accurate for the whole region, but certainly for important countries, that we continue to look away, turn away from their human rights or democracy abuses.
Now, so this is a pretty deep critique. It's not the critique that Governor Romney is making. I mean, to the extent that he's isolating policy differences with respect to the Arab Spring, to the best that I can tell, it has to do more with the specific handling and the communications from the embassy in in Cairo at the time that the protesters had breached the embassy, than with a sort of larger vision of what U.S. policy in the region should be. How do you evaluate what Romney has had to say on this constellation of subjects, and what merit do you see in it?
Yeah, well, Governor Romney has not offered a real strategic vision for the Middle East. That's been almost wholly lacking, in part because he simply hasn't had to focus on it much. To the extent that he has talked about Middle East policy, Iran and Israel have gotten a lot of his attention. So one of his critiques is that Obama has not been sufficiently supportive of Israel, or Obama hasn't drawn clear red lines as he should on Iran. But in terms of the Arab Spring specifically, Romney's response is also incoherent. Part of that is because of his base and Republican elites seem to want different things. So you have the kind of neocon elites, if we want to call them that, who are supporting a pro-democracy approach still. That's important to how they view the region. But if you're looking at the Tea Party side of it, there's a lot of, why are we so involved? Arabs are going around protesting and burning down embassies. Maybe we should kind of take a step back and stay with our allies, the ones that we know. And there's also this fear of these rising Islamist movements and the sense that the U.S. shouldn't be supporting those movements. So that's what you've heard from Michelle Bachmann and some other Republicans, is why did we throw Mubarak under the bus, so to speak? Why are we allowing the Muslim Brotherhood to rise to power? So because you have these two very conflicting critiques within Republican circles, it makes it difficult for Republicans to come up with a coherent narrative in regards to Obama's approach. Now, I do think there is an underlying narrative that has emerged that both sides of this debate share, and it's that the Obama administration has presided over a loss of credibility in the Middle East for different reasons, but that's the basic takeaway.
You mean that both the sort of neocon movement
Yes.
and the sort of Tea Partiers kind of can both...
Yeah. They share a critique that the Obama administration's response has been ad hoc, inconsistent, and incoherent, and that because of that, the U.S. has lost credibility in the region. Now, I would actually share So,
the whole first part of that, right? The ad hoc and incoherent is similar to your critique. Do you think there's been a loss of credibility?
I would go further and say there's a widespread perception in the Middle East that Obama is a weak and somewhat feckless leader. Now, whether or not it's fair is a different issue we can debate, but I think that sense is very much there. And if you look, for example, I mean, there's been a cycle of U.S. threats and then backing down from them. So I think over time, Arab leaders have started to wonder if they can really count on what the Obama administration says. I'll give you a couple examples. When Obama was talking tough on the settlement issue with Israel, and that was a big thing they were pushing early on, right? Netanyahu resisted and didn't meet those expectations, but the U.S. backed down and ceased to make that an issue and ceased to really put pressure on Israel to meet its expectations on that. The NGO crisis in Egypt that happened earlier this year, where the U.S. threatened to freeze aid because American NGOs were being closed down to the extent that American citizens had to hold themselves up in the U.S. embassy. And this led to a very tense situation. But when push came to shove, the military-led government at that point in Egypt did the bare minimum and continued its war on American and Egyptian NGOs, and we continued the aid. The aid continued flowing with no consequence. So that sets a very dangerous precedent, where the lesson there that I think some people took at least was when you stand up to the U.S. and you hold your ground, Obama is going to back down sooner or later. And you can see a trend there. You can see a pattern emerging where there's a lack of trust and a lack of respect for Obama. Let's talk about Gulf leaders who are presumably our allies in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They're very suspicious of Obama because they feel that Obama has done too much to support the Arab revolutions. But the odd thing is, if you talk to Arab protesters and revolutionaries, they think that the U.S. is still on the side of dictators. So when Obama splits the middle, as he often does, he ends up alienating both sides of the debate. At some point, especially considering how historic this is, you have to take a side and stick to it and have more consistency. But I think now it's very difficult to see where the consistent, credible approach is in Obama's policy.
All right, so now it's 2 months from now, and we either have a second term of an Obama administration coming or a first term of a Romney administration coming. How do you restore that credibility if you're the next president or the continuation of this president? I mean, what's the strategy going forward that allows you to balance a very conflicting set of interests in a rather diverse group of countries and still preserve some significant credibility and consistency of approach? Is it actually a squarable circle, or is it not?
To some extent, it's not a squarable circle. So I'm not actually very optimistic that any administration would do the sorts of things that I would want them to do. But that gets us to a bigger discussion about, I mean, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for really 50 years was oriented almost entirely around the status quo and maintaining the status quo. It was about not rocking the boat. It was not about prioritizing democracy. Now, if your whole bureaucratic structure is oriented towards that approach for decades, it's very difficult when the Arab Spring comes to do a 180 and to adopt a rather different approach. So I think some of it is embedded in the structure here. And it would take a very bold, aggressive, if you will, president to really decide to make it a priority to reorient U.S. policy. Now, what might that look like if there was a political will to do so? You know, I should have actually mentioned Syria earlier because I think that's exhibit number one for what I'm talking about here. There's been a lot of harsh rhetoric from the Obama administration. This is a disgusting horrible regime and so on and so forth. A lot of strong rhetoric. But the rhetoric is rarely translated into policy. And rhetoric can obviously only take you so far. Now, the Obama's threats to saying that Assad has to leave now, Assad has to do this, no one takes those calls seriously because they're not backed up. The only way you can really back those up is by, if you want to go further, is to include a credible military threat, to have red lines for the Assad regime, and if they continue crossing them, you put the military option on the table. And not just a U.S. military threat, there's no real political will for that, obviously, but having an Arab or Turkish-led operation with U.S. air power backing it up and Western air power backing it up. A Libya kind of scenario. But there's a real sense that the Obama administration is not going to go in that direction. So what that leads to, when the Syrian regime is calculating its moves, they say, we don't think Obama is serious. So we're going to continue the slaughter, we're going to continue the massacres because there is no will in the international community. And again, this shows how the U.S. is indispensable because everyone wants to do something, but everyone's looking around waiting for the U.S. to give the green light. The Turks won't do anything. The Gulf countries won't get more serious until they know that the U.S. is serious.
So so you have to deal with Syria, and in your account, you have to deal with Syria by being prepared to be involved in a military operation. What else? I mean, that presumably will not satisfy protesters in Benghazi, right? Or will it?
It won't. That by itself is not enough. So sometimes this boutique case-by-case strategy is not enough. It has to be part of a broader vision. So I'd also include a much greater financial commitment to the Arab transitions. As I said earlier, there hasn't been a lot of new money allocated to these countries, with the partial exception of Tunisia. Now, what I advocate in the paper that I wrote for Romneys Campaign 2012 is a multilateral reform endowment that is U.S.-led, but tries to get the support of other major powers and rising democracies. And this endowment, I kind of put a number of at least $5 billion, which I think is actually feasible and also would have some bite, but it could possibly be more. It should be more even, considering what's at stake. Now, that's important because the only way leverage works is if countries have something to lose or if they have something to gain. And if you have a big pot of money out there and say, listen, we're not going to cut anyone's aid, but we're going to offer additional aid if countries are willing to meet certain explicit benchmarks on political reform, on making progress on democracy. And if they do meet them, that a lot of money will be available to them. So that's important not just from the policy standpoint, it's also the right message from a public diplomacy standpoint. Because what that says to Arabs is, we're going to condition a lot of new money, not based on the interests of pre-Arab Spring. We're not going to make it conditional on Israel or security cooperation. We're going to make it conditional on our values as Americans. And we're going to put our money where our mouths are and make democracy the determining factor in allocating new aid. I think that would send a very strong message to Arab audiences that the U.S. is getting more serious.
Shadi, thanks very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.